Hello, and welcome to the Food Security for Equitable Futures expert interview video series. In this series, we interview experts in the field of food insecurity to gain a non-technical understanding of this pressing social problem and how it can be addressed. I'm Jasmine Fledderjohann. I'm a senior lecturer at Lancaster University in the UK, and I'm the principal investigator on the Food Security for Equitable Futures project. I'm very happy to be here today with a leading expert in food insecurity. So to begin, please can I ask you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, starting with your name, your current institution, and your areas of interest.
My name is Eduardo Zegarra. I am from Peru. I work in the Group for the Analysis of Development, GREAT. It's an institution for research in socioeconomic issues. I work in food insecurity and rural development issues for the last 2 decades, and basically working more in issues related to agriculture and rural development.
Great, thank you. So could I ask you to just say a little bit more about your experience working on food insecurity, and particularly, do you have any particular expertise in any specific countries or regions within countries?
Well, my research in food security, I will say, is more in the scope of the public policies. A decade ago, I was in charge of doing what we call a strategic program for food insecurity that was asked by the Ministry of Finance. That document was important because it tried to articulate different policies and different ministries around the issues of food insecurity. And after that, I have some participation in different spaces in which we discuss policy issues. A year ago, I was involved in the new version of a policy for food and nutritional insecurity that is going to be approved soon, looking at the next 10 years. And in the midst of a severe crisis from the pandemic and also from the increases in food prices in the last months.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And I think that leads really naturally to my next question for you, which is, what do you think the biggest food insecurity challenge in Peru is going to be in the next few years? Thinking both about maybe short-term issues, but also maybe longer-term challenges as well.
Yes, we have a short-term, very severe crisis that we have to face right away, as we are having some political troubles here in Peru, and authorities are not showing enough interest and focus on the food crisis, and that's really a big problem. But Peru has been severely hit by the increase in prices of food commodities, especially cereals and oil. And also we are having a severe crisis because of the increase in the prices of fertilizers. Both crises are affecting the families and also the agricultural sector at the same time. And in the next year, this crisis probably is going to get deeper, especially after the conflict between Russia and Ukraine that have worsened the situation. So we have to face this short-term but very acute and problematic crisis. And also, as you say, we have to also start to look at the structural problems of food insecurity in Peru. We have very high figures in anemia for children and women. We have high rates of malnutrition and chronic problems with nutrition for children especially. And we have some improvement in the last decade, but basically not very stable. Still, the presence of the state and public policies on social protection in Peru is really, really weak. So that makes it difficult to cope with these structural problems. So the challenge in the future are those problems, and also an emerging very important problem is the combination of malnutrition, obesity, and hunger. So at the same time, even in parts of the population.
Yeah, and I think that really you've covered a lot of both sort of what the challenges are and also why food insecurity is such an important topic. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about sort of who's being most impacted on in terms of food insecurity in Peru. Do we know who the groups who are most vulnerable are?
Yes, we have particularly vulnerable groups in the indigenous communities and also in the rural sectors and the poor urban population. In general, we are talking about 30 to 40% of the population that faces food vulnerability. The World Food Program has ended a study recently that the figure that they have is about 50% of Peruvian population is with food insecurity, vulnerability. So really it's a problem of large scale here in Peru. It's not a problem for a minority, it's a problem for the majority. And also the situation, the structural situation is also very, very difficult for about 30% of the population that lives under the poverty line. So the magnitude of the problem is important, is of high relevance, and requires really very ambitious policies and capacities for dealing with it.
Okay. I do have some questions for you about your thoughts on social policy, but if I can just backtrack for a minute, you've mentioned COVID-19. Obviously, COVID-19, I think, has really brought food insecurity to the foreground globally, really. But I'm curious about the impact of COVID-19, particularly on food insecurity in Peru. Would you be happy to speak a little bit more about that, please?
That was one of the main issues that we tried to raise in the middle of the pandemics. In general, we found that we have several problems around it. The first one was that nobody was measuring really what's happening with food insecurity. Currently, Peru doesn't have a measure of food insecurity. We only measure poverty, and we have some measures of malnutrition, but not of food insecurity. So we couldn't really know if food security deteriorated during the pandemic because we didn't have an official measure of that. We have evidence of the very acute deterioration. For example, we have in Lima, the city in which we live 10 million people, that these spaces of food community management that we call ollas comunes, or we say that people organize to feed themselves. We have about 3,000 of those ollas comunes around the city that were a clear indication of the severity of the crisis, because this is desperate people trying to get food and organized to feed themselves with whatever they can. The state was very slow in attending the problem. We are now discussing how to give some resources to these ollas comunes. But in general, the situation with the COVID was clearly one of deterioration of food security for people. And also we found out that the Peruvian state doesn't have a clear tool and instrument for measuring the problem and also for tackling the problem.
So the ollas comunes, is that a group that's grown within Lima over the period of the pandemic? Has the work that they've been doing, have they been passing out more food, or how have they signaled that there's a growing problem?
Yeah, well, they appeared for the first time with the COVID. We didn't have those type of experiences before. The ollas comunes were used by strikers in the 70s when how do we call the unions make a strike. They organize these ollas comunes to survive the strike. So there were not permanent or even in the near future, we didn't have that kind of organization.
Mm-hmm.
Now with the pandemic and the severe crisis in the incomes and capacity of people for buying food, we estimate that around 300,000 people are feeding with ollas comunes now in Lima, and that's a very huge number, and also is a measure of the level of desperation and also the capacity of organization that the Peruvian population also has for facing this problem.
Mm-hmm. It really goes to highlight how important it is to measure the problem. I think it's easy to not think about measurement as hugely important, but actually you can't address a problem that you don't know is there. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more. Obviously, you've mentioned measurement as a sort of gap in what we know about food insecurity. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the gaps in what we know about food insecurity in Peru, and where would you like to see more research evidence?
Yes, well, the main vacuum, I will say, in the Peruvian case is that we don't have an official measure of food insecurity, and that really is an urgent necessity. It's almost impossible to organize policies if you don't have a measure, a clear understanding of what's going on and what factors are really behind the problem. Peru has a long tradition now with surveys for measuring poverty and other social indicators. So we have the capacity of doing a measure, but the problem we have is that the government in Peru is not organized around these type of issues that are transsectoral, like food insecurity. So all the views that the government have is sectorized, and they don't have the food insecurity is transsectoral. It requires an approach that is multi-sectoral. So we also need probably to research a little bit more why the Peruvian state is not able to organize in terms of a huge problem like the food insecurity. It's an institutional problem. I've been dealing with that in the last decade, trying to promote a reorganization of the state in this area, so we can have an authority for food security and a measure and different areas in which we can take decisions in policy terms.
Okay. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts. Obviously, you have a wealth of expertise in social policy. So how do you think social policy can address food insecurity? What would you want to see going forward?
Yes, the issue here in Peru is one of the Andean countries with the weakest social protection network. So we have really a very weak health system, public health system, especially the COVID, for example, show us that Peru was really in a very poor position for facing a pandemic. And we also don't have many instruments for protecting people in terms of the insecurity in jobs, in employment, or insecurity in terms of food, or insecurity in terms of health. In general, it's a very small government with the tax. The taxing in Peru is about 15% of GDP, one of the lowest in the region. So the state is weak, and also the government is not really well organized and efficient. So we have some social programs, basically one of transfers that we call Juntos, and also another program for the adults, but those are totally insufficient for facing the huge problems of social insecurity in Peru. Our system of pensions is also collapsing, and we don't have unemployment insurance. So in general, people live really with scant social protection. So, and that's really one of the problems that mostly affect the food insecurity for people.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of people who don't know much about food insecurity focus on the food element, but actually thinking about a broader range of social protection really starts to speak to some of the structural issues that you mentioned earlier. It's not just a matter of not having access to food, but also having income, having appropriate housing, having access to different things that support you to be able to access food as well.
Yeah, that's totally true. In the document that we were working for a new policy for food insecurity, we put the social protection issue at the front of the necessity or the needs for a different future. We think that this is why the food insecurity has to be tackled with an overall view, an integral view of the problem. So, and people needs instruments for protecting for different shocks that they suffer every day and every year. So, and we don't have the minimum instruments for doing that. So people have to cope whatever they can. This is why they organize themselves, trying to solve the problem. In some cases, that's good, but also is limited. It cannot solve all the problems, and in general, there are limitations for people only self-organizing. That is good, but obviously it's not enough for tackling the problem.
Yeah. So, you know, you've mentioned already some aspects of what people who are members of the public are doing to address food insecurity in their communities. Do you think there's any role for non-governmental agencies to work with government to address food insecurity?
Sure, we have really an important network of NGOs in Peru, some of them working on food security. I belong to one of those networks that is called Perusan, that basically it's about 40 NGOs working, basically trying to raise attention and doing some policy incidents. And that's a very valuable tool, a very valuable contribution to issues. The problem that we have is with the government. The government is very disorganized and is not able to channel these suggestions and these proposals. In general, the proposal for food security requires a high capacity for articulation and for integrating policies, and is the main problem with the Peruvian state. It doesn't have any capacity for articulation and tackling a problem of this complexity with the structure that it has. So that's a consensus also in this network of NGOs, and with that we have really an institutional problem to solve in the first place.
Okay. So in terms of thinking about your future work, is that something that your future work is going to look into, how to address that issue, or what are your future plans for work on food insecurity?
Yes, I keep a high interest in the institutional part of this problem. We sometimes look at other countries, for example, Brazil, in which 10 or 15 years ago, they launched this program Hambre Cero, or Zero Hunger. And basically they created an authority for a ministerial authority for the food security. We are clear that that's something, or some sort of thing, that we need here in Peru. And also, in my case, I'm more inclined to work with the rural sector. So my inclination in terms of research is going to the specificities of food insecurity for rural population, for agriculturalists that are one of the most vulnerable sectors in Peru. We have 2.2 million farmers in Peru, family farms, about 7 million people living in rural areas, And those areas are particularly hit by different problems of food insecurity that are different from the problems that urban sector face. So in my case, I will do probably much more work on the rural area, I hope.
Okay. Can I ask you to just say a little bit more about that, please, in terms of what the unique challenges are in rural and versus urban areas in Peru?
Well, in Peru, the geography is really it's a blessing and also what do you say, a huge problem. We have a very difficult geography. We have these huge mountains called the Andes, and the connectivity of rural areas to markets is weak and problematic. And we have rural population, even if they produce for agricultural products that are useful for them because they can consume them, they also have a huge demand for products that come from the cities. So feeding rural population is not only a thing of agricultural production, but also of industrial production of food in the cities. And the terms of exchange are very unfavorable for rural population, and they tend to suffer really serious problems of hunger and food insecurity that go totally unnoticed because there are no measurement, there are no monitoring of these problems. So I think we have to be more conscious of this problem in rural areas, that they don't have the capacity of organization that urban sectors have, and they face their problem with much less social protection even than we have, the weak social protection that we have in cities. So that's why I think it's a sector that requires a specific and really a more deeper understanding.
Okay, thank you. Well, I look forward to following your future work on this. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. This has been a fantastic conversation, and good luck to you with your future research.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.